Hey everybody, it's episode 7, and today we have a very interesting topic again on weather. Once again, it's with the BAM weather team. Remember a few weeks ago when Michael Clark came on as an interview and we spoke with him by phone about the outlook for summer or early spring. They have now released their summer outlook and given us a peek into some thoughts they've been thinking about in this growing season. And it is a 50-some minute long webinar packed full of great information for the growing season. And so I'm going to go ahead and be quiet and let them get started. And I think it's well worth the time spent here. They have some very useful, some good information today.
All right, guys, welcome. We are going to let some people file in. I appreciate you joining the webinar. All right, we got some people filing in. Hundreds of you have registered. So once we get going here, we've got one more minute, and we'll get started. All right, so just bear with us. If you're just getting in, just bear with us, and we'll get started in about 1 minute. All right, guys. Looks like most of you are here. It's 11 a.m., so we'll get rolling. Okay. Want to welcome everybody to our growing season outlook, and all of you that have registered to view it. We're going to try and make it quick. I know everybody's busy and likes things to be fast, so we'll do it as fast as we can. Here's what we're going to break down today. All right, you can kind of see everything we're going to be talking about. Myself, Michael Clark, we have Brett Waltz with us and Kirk Hens, and we'll be kind of having an open-ended discussion. There is an option to have a Q&A. At any time, you can post your questions here to the Q&A section of the webinar, and we will answer them as we go. All right, so feel free to post those at any time, and we'll interact with you all and get going. All right, so let's dive right in. All right, we're going to talk about the 2019 summer review. We're going to talk about the ENSO evolution and the potential that we're going into a La Nina. We'll talk about the drought monitor, our analogs, the seasonal data, and of course our forecast. And then we'll also talk about the hurricane season thoughts. And we will talk about the new app that is tremendously awesome. All right, so we'll talk about all that stuff here as we get rolling. So let's get right into it. We'll go into the first slide, and what we're going to talk about first is the review of last year's forecast. Okay, what an interesting year it was. You know, we started out just absolutely soaking wet, and then that helped us kind of stay cooler. It was active in parts, drier in other parts. It was just a weird year, you know, where we started. It just was not a friendly season overall. The outlooks that we had posted last year really panned out very well in terms of, especially the temperature outlook, pretty much nailed it. The areas we missed were Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, where we had them wetter than average, and they ended up being actually a little bit drier than average. The corn yield actually ended below trend line, a lot of that due to just how wet the start was. But overall, a very good forecast on all fronts here in terms of a 90-day outlook, you know, from a month ahead or so. So pleased with that. Okay. CDD forecast was an 887. The verification was a 916. We just show the verification to show you that here's what it was. You know, it's not a, hey, look how good we are. It's just a matter of showing you what we said and what happened. So really the topic for the entire growing season is the evolution towards a La Nina. And especially just over the last month, we've seen a significant trend in the equatorial temperature anomalies in the at the subsurface, beneath the surface in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. You see these oranges and reds get quickly eroded here by a really stout cold pool developing in the subsurface area of the equatorial Pacific. Really kind of probably suggesting the El Nino or La Nina is probably inevitable at this point here at some point, right? So you can see the daily index has tanked here, and the forecast models pretty much across the board are all in line with a weak La Nina by June. All right, we can see the actual map here, the sea surface temperature anomaly here across the equatorial Pacific has cooled drastically, but the Pacific is still very warm. Okay, the MDR and the Atlantic is also very warm. So all this is going to play into the outlook that we have in store for you today. But a developing La Nina, most of you probably think it's going to get hot and dry. Well, maybe, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that. So let's get right into it. Brett, let's talk a little bit about just the overall idea behind all of this, the ENSO evolution, and how we've come up with what we have.
Yeah, so it was really kind of a slow transition into cooler ENSO state. It took a long time. A lot of these La Nina years go right into it right after winter, and we're just now seeing that big drop right now. It really started about a month ago, and we've dropped about a whole degree Celsius in the equatorial Pacific, which is a substantial drop, one of the sharpest drops this time of year that we've seen in the last 30 years. And so there's a couple of ways to look at it. Number one, it looks like we are going to be in a weak La Nina, or at least a cool neutral ENSO state as you average out all of summer. And if we just look at the most recent years, and it's important to look at recent years because the climate is different. It's just an overall warmer climate than it has been back if we were looking in the 50s and 60s. And you can see that it generally favors, when you have this La Nina, warmer temperatures across a good majority of the United States. What it does favor, though, is it favors kind of a gradient in dry risk to the west and cooler risks off to the east. You may get some flow around the ridge. We're going to talk about this a lot. The risk of storm clusters, derechos, MCSs over the top of a ridge of high pressure out to the west, and that can lead to heavy rain chances at times. At times, not saying that it's a whole summer of heavy rain chances, but it can lead to heavy rain chances at times over the top, and that's just what the La Nina would say. Now, if we look at the years that had a very sharp drop like this year, again, it's kind of the same thing. It's maybe just a little bit more extreme. You've got more warmth, especially located down there in the plains, the central plains, and then that leads to a stronger ridge and an even greater chance of those storm
Brett.
clusters going around the top.
Hang on.
Sorry.
It's not liking what I'm doing here. Sorry about that. There you go.
No, you're good. I thought I did something wrong because usually it's about the time in the webinar that I screw something up. So, but anyway, if we go back to the drop analogs, there we go. You can see there's two things that I notice on that preset map. Is that one, you've got strong northwest flow risks with those storm clusters over the top, and you also have a tropical source. And we're going to talk about this later, but La Ninas generally favor a much more active tropical season, and I think that we are going to be dealing with the influences of that throughout a good part of the summer, especially as we work into later in July and August.
Kirk, I feel like we're seeing a lot of similarities here from 2016. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, 2016, the reason I agree on two fronts is it was overall, warmer than normal, which the way we're coming out of El Nino going towards La Nina, I think it's inevitable. Does that warmth come during the day or overnight? If I had to hedge my bets, I'd say there's probably a good risk for warm overnight low temperatures. Maybe something familiar sounds like 2010 or 2018. I think that's on the table here as well. But when you throw 2016 in the mix, the first thing, at least, that pops in my mind is that northwest flow. You know, you have derechos that go right through near Chicago, and when you have a strong gradient of warm and dry, especially to the west, this is something that, you know, it hasn't just set up last week. It's been setting up for months. Typically, you just start to see the ridge migrate to where you're warmest and driest, and that would be the western plains, and that is just a tip-off to me that there can be a nice flow of moisture to wrap around that and drop right into the Midwest and some of these areas here as well, which have already had a tendency to be very wet. You know, the last 30 days, we've seen some areas get 5 to 10 inches of rain right where those analogs are wet, so that can be a tip-off too.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of leads us into Brett did some extensive research on similar drought setups. Brett, talk about what you found here.
Yeah, so wanted to go back and look here at years that are kind of transitioning similar to this year as far as the drought goes. And, you know, off the bat, it doesn't sound like it would be a huge deal, but once you start building in warmth, summer-like warmth, you're going to get localized enhancement of warmth, more heat over areas that are drier. The dry ground heats up warmer and it heats up faster than wet soils. And so it can kind of create a risk of higher pressure over the areas that are in droughts. And you can see this year we've got, in some spots, an extreme drought across southeastern parts of Colorado into western Kansas right now. This will update tomorrow, but we've seen this expand pretty rapidly over the last couple of weeks. And what that can do is lead to that high pressure over the western U.S. And if we look at the most similar years, 2002, 2003, 2015, 2018. And again, these aren't necessarily perfect matches for the summer as a whole, but if we just look at it from a drought perspective, I'm noticing something similar in these years to what we are already seeing kind of in our week 2 forecast pattern. Again, they all have the dryness down to the south, especially the southwest. They also have the drier risk down by the Gulf Coast. We've seen actually some fires down in parts of Florida. How unusual is that? Florida having wildfires? I mean, that's not something you hear every year. These years, I tried to find years that had hints of that, at least. It's not easy to find, that's for sure. But these years definitely had some similarities. And if we look at the temperature composite for these years, I think that it shows you the risk of having a high pressure over the Rockies as we work into summer. Maybe you get some over-the-top warmth. Maybe you get some return flow and some cooler air down to the south. But what's really interesting about this map here is that it looks almost exactly like our week 2 forecast right now. I mean, I don't think that's a coincidence that we are already seeing some similarities there. And I think that it just means that we're probably going to deal with some warmth and high pressure across the Rockies into the western U.S., and that can kind of lead to some cooler air down to the south. As far as the ag belt, the eastern ag belt specifically, maybe that leads to kind of a push and pull, and at the very least, a good gradient for precipitation. And again, there's that northwest flow. That's, I think, the third analog we've showed now that has that northwest flow look. Minnesota into the Great Lakes, northern Illinois, northern Indiana especially, and then towards the East Coast. And again, the Deep South, maybe that starts to get a little bit wetter there. And again, I think a lot of that's due to tropical activity.
Yeah. I want to add something too about the northwest flow for those that maybe don't understand what that means. And you can look at this map and you can see, man, we're just soaking wet. It's just going to be a soaking wet summer. There's no issues. Well, you can have 2 derechos come through in 3 months and they can bring 10 inches of rain and you can be above normal for that aggregate. Mm-hmm. So that does not mean northwest flow does not mean no problems. Northwest flow means you have a tendency for storm clusters, and the overall average you can end up above normal on precipitation, but that does not mean there's no dry spells. And that's a very clear point.
Yeah, I mean, in 2012, if it weren't for the derechos, there wouldn't have been any crop in the Eastern Corn Belt at all. So those can save you as much as they can hurt you. You can blow corn over and flatten it with those. Those we do have a concern for those. Just because there's moisture doesn't mean it may be the most friendliest of moistures.
Right.
Exactly. If that makes sense. But So yeah, great point. So going forward here, let's get on to the next slide. We're talking about our analogs, and we've looked at three different basically kind of classifications or methods, because we have a hard time finding one that all shares a year in common or all have the same kind of setup. I mean, it's just, this is a weird year. So Brett, talk about the methodology here with what you've done with these analogs.
Yeah, and like you said, there isn't a year. 2016 may be close, but there really isn't any other years that are like, yes, those are great matches for this year. And it comes down to the pace of the drop in ENSO this year. The development of La Nina is later than normal. We went through spring and it was steady, more in El Nino territory, and now we're just now crashing, and it's later than normal. And if you look at the ENSO evolution, these are the years that dropped at the most similar pace to this year. Look at those years. They're all, except for 1995, they're all before 1980. And so again, that just tells you that for recent history, we're in rare territory, and that analogs aren't going to be one-to-one. So when we mention a year, I wouldn't necessarily, don't think in your head, oh crap, it's going to be like 2016, or it's going to be like, whatever year that we spit out. We have to look at things as a whole, and we've got to look at multiple different things to really deduce what the pattern is going to do. And so if we look at the years, even dating back to the 1950s, does suggest warmer risks across a good bit of the ag belt as we work into summer. And we've had that idea for a while. We know that a lot of times La Ninas do lead to warmer temperatures. The big question is precip, and does suggest some dry risks. A ridge sets up over the central U.S. at times, and it can be drier at times. But you can see the hints of northwest flow, of those clusters that come in. And I think that these show pretty well what Kirk was talking about, that there can be dry time. All of these show that there can be dry pockets, that there can be dry times. May not necessarily mean that the whole Great Lakes is going to get in on it. You may get unlucky and miss them all. I mean, that's possible. But I think that all of these show that idea. Now, if we look over to our tropical forcing analogs, basically what that means is just similarities in how the upward motion is in the ENSO regions and in the Pacific. And again, shows a warmer idea, but it has the ridge placed a little bit further to the north and to the east, more over the Great Lakes to the upper Midwest. That's important. These are two important differences, because if you get that big dry ridge set up, as you see in the ENSO evolution, that's a drier ridge to the forecast, I would say. Would you all agree? Maybe you get those stronger MCSs over the top, but I think that for the plains, especially if you get that big ridge to set up, that can lead to more pronounced dryness at times.
I agree. I think what's interesting, though, Brett, as you pointed out, these are all pre-1980, and it seems as though that's not as common in the newer era of these La Ninas.
I would agree.
And I think that's the word on the street, is La Nina just means hot and dry, and it really doesn't mean that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look back at some of our top 5 most recent wettest years on record, they're all like post 2010, or at least post 2000. That should tell you that this climate that we're in, think about months like September. It's always warm in September, and it seems like the year as a whole, summer as a whole, always hosts some wetter risks. That's a new climate thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so basically, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, you're fine, Brett. I was just going to tie on to when you talk about everything you see here. I think the question is where's the ridge going to set up and when? And it may be a summer where it might set up at an unfavorable time. So we talked about this on AgriTalk the other day, Kirk, is summer may be okay, except if the AAM goes negative and the ridge and the heat set up right during pollination, that obviously can hurt things. but the driest risks are the Western Corn Belt, and the wettest risks are the Eastern Corn Belt right now. And I think that's the easiest way we can take away from that. I'm going to go to the precip first. I'll go back, but talk about these models. I mean, let's look at this. We see, when I'm highlighting this, you can kind of see this. Look at the flow here. You look at the flow here over the top. And you've got the Jamstec doing the same thing. You can kind of see this as evident in some of these computer models. These models, as much as everyone probably hates to admit, they did pretty doggone good for the winter forecast. I mean, there was a lot of indication that we thought the models were crazy for winter, and they weren't.
Yeah. It's I think these kind of show the risk. They all have the general idea. The only one that's drier is that in-car CCSM one, which we show that just to show the risk, pinning where exactly the ridge sets up. If it goes up into Canada and you completely cut off the jet, something like that's not impossible. I don't think it's likely,
Right.
But for the most part, pretty good consistency here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then in the temperature modeling as well, it's there's some indication of a trough of some sort. Now, I do want to mention the number one factor, the wild card that we have to monitor, in my opinion, is the global winds, the what we call the angular momentum. We have yet to see, typically in a La Nina. In a La Nina, typically those global winds are slower, or what we call negative, and there's more ridging going on across the globe. We haven't seen that yet, and for us, I don't think it's a matter of if, but when that AAM tanks, and when it does, I think that there could be a period for 30 so days that can get extraordinarily hot and dry. And I think we have to find out, I think right now we would probably favor the Western Corn Belt for that to happen. But I do think if and when that drops, I think it's going to be a pretty big eye-opener because of where we're going with the overall atmosphere towards a possible La Nina. What do you guys think? I mean,
Yeah, I think it's all about the timing of when that drops and where the ridge is. Because if you combine that with the drop and the winds start to slow down and you get more ridging, and that ridge happens to be more over the Great Lakes, you're going to, like Brett said, you're going to cut off the jet stream. And I know these sound like what ifs, but these are the very real problems because, we can have great soil moisture, but if we shut off precipitation and increase temperatures late June into early July in that time frame, that's not everything that matters, but it's a lot of what matters. So I think it is definitely not an if, but a when.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that you're going to have a time where it just, it gets quiet as far as the precipitation goes. I think that when that happens, you're going to stall out the ridge wherever it may be, and you're going to get dry for a time. Now, and that may even be into the Eastern Belt at times, even say into Illinois, Missouri, maybe even Southwest Indiana for a time. But I think that until that happens, I think that you've kind of got a push and a pull. You don't have a set pattern. Yeah. We're kind of seeing that. We're kind of seeing two different types of patterns set up right now, I think. One is that ridge and the warmth in the western U.S., and into the western plains, and then the second is the ridge over the Great Lakes and the warmth there. And so maybe you don't have a set pattern until that AAM drops. Of course, unclear when exactly that drops. We think it's going to at some point, but the question is just when. And when that happens, where's the ridge set up at when that happens? Would typically favor more of a western plains with the AAM drop, but I think that until then you may have back and forth warmth with the core being over the western plains and the western U.S. at times, and then to the Great Lakes at times. And for that reason, you can see here on our monthly outlooks, June especially, we didn't put any much below normal, any much above normal for both temperatures and precip, because if you have that back and forth, it's going to be hard to get one spot that's well above normal for both temperatures or precip, or well below normal.
Yeah, I mean, it's really one of those things where I think that it's possible that in terms of weather for growing conditions, overall, there's not a huge glaring problem. The major what if factor, the major wild card, and I say major because this is a huge deal. You have to understand, we can't tell you when this is going to happen. We can tell you based off how things are trending that it's possible that it can. But the AAM is the huge wild card here. We've seen the models try taking it negative a couple of times here, and they keep failing. Now it's correcting back, staying more positive again.
And maybe I can help describe to people why that's a big deal. AAM, why does that matter to me? Well, AAM, atmospheric angular momentum, if we're positive, think El Nino. El Nino, think active jet streams. You're going to get plenty of moisture. You're not going to have a moisture problem. So you have to, in La Nina, you typically have negative AAMs, but if you do not drop that AAM, you will continue to have an active jet stream and you will continue to have moisture. That's why it's so important.
Yeah, and the easiest way it can be put. I mean, so to sum up growing condition weather, the western half, you're at a bigger risk for hotter and drier. The eastern half, I think you'll have more wet than dry, but I still think it's possible there could be a period of hot and dry once that AAM tanks. That's the easiest way to put this. And this is one of the this is the most challenging summer outlook I've ever been a part of. We have a very hard time coming up with conclusions just for June.
Yeah.
So that's just the way that it goes. Yeah.
Not often you get 2-year El Ninos and going into a La Nina.
Right. Yeah. What is there? I think it's only happened 5 times, right? 5 or 6 times.
Well, I think like 3 times.
I think it's the 4th or 5th time. Yeah, it's not. And last year was weird. Winter felt like a strong El Nino, but it wasn't, and so that makes it even more weird, more rare. So we've had to look into years that went into a La Nina off of a Super Nino just because of how the atmosphere was in the winter.
We have an interesting question, Brett, from Doug Gillum. Doug says, earlier in the spring, we talked about 05 being a strong analog a lot. And here recently, we haven't talked about it as much. What do we think?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because we did talk about 05 a lot. It was a really good analog in winter. It was pretty good for a good part of spring. The reason that we are not talking about it quite as much is because that was a slower drop in ENSO, which we thought for a time may be possible because of how late we've progressed. But over the last month, we've dropped so sharply with ENSO. It's just a deviation from 2005. There are still some things about 2005 that I don't hate. The Pacific, I think, was pretty good. And it did go into a Nina, so it's not like an awful analog. It's definitely worth looking at and worth watching. But again, it's just kind of that speed of the drop has made it a little bit less of a match as far as get where the ridge may set up, and just the speed of things is just different than 05. But there are still some things that are decent.
Yeah.
Like 05. If 05 does become a better analog, that would support more, especially the southern plains, western plains getting a little bit wetter, and then I think it was a little bit drier, especially across the Great Lakes, which we mentioned that risk possible.
Yeah, there was a drought right there in 05.
Yeah, needs to be watched.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So, to sum this up, our summer CDD forecast is a 935. Okay. Last year was a 916. So we overall forecast a possible warmer summer overall. If there's going to be an area that is prone to problems the most, in our opinion right now, that's probably going to be somewhere in here. All right, in terms of just hotter and drier conditions. Now, again, the AAM drop is the huge wild card. But being that it started drier here, and it's pretty doggone wet in here, it's adding to our confidence level that that's probably where the tendency of the ridging is going to be, is west. So that's the area I would be most concerned with when it comes to growing weather, just in general. In terms of where it's going to be the warmest, it's not going to be in Texas, I don't think. I don't think we're looking at big Texas heat this summer. I don't think we're looking at big heat in Seattle, in the Pacific Northwest, but the warmer tendencies are probably going to run from New York City to Chicago down through Los Angeles. So those are some bigger cities that certainly will weigh in on the CDD forecast of 935. If we were to have Texas, Dallas area warmer, we'd probably be pushing 960, 970 even. It's a big area in the energy market. But regardless, I think the biggest concern on the precip side is going to be the corridor for the derechos and the MCS clusters, probably right in this area here. These clusters like to develop up in here and take sharp southeast dives, and they like to produce wind damage and swaths of 80, 90 mile per hour winds at times. Wouldn't be so shocked to see a notable derecho event, one or two of them this summer, if this pattern can evolve the way we think it might. Okay, so that's kind of the outlook for summer there in general. And again, please feel free to ask questions on that if you have them. Now, going forward, we still have a couple of things to discuss, and that's the wild cards. And Brett, talk about, Kirk as well. You guys have looked a lot into the QBO. I mean, what in the devil's going on with this QBO?
It's doing something that only one other year has ever done on record. So records go back to this one all the way back to 1956. So that's what, 64, 65 years almost. So that's a lot of years. And you can see it. Normally it goes around in a circle. It goes from the positive phase to the negative phase and just does that every year or two. And it's normal. This year, you can see the latest blue line going into the middle there. And that the only other year that went out of phase was 2016, which is another reason why we're keeping an eye on it. Now, we're a little bit different, coming from a little bit of a different spot than 2016, but to be completely honest, we don't know what this is going to do to the pattern because it's never happened before. We don't know if it's going to change up the MJO. We don't know if it's going to, disrupt the Enso evolution. We just don't know. It's just going to be something that's going to have to be researched after this year. We can kind of look at 2016 and say, okay, this was the other year that went out of phase, so we're noticing some similarities with 2016 already. Maybe there's something to that. But again, it's just going to be something that we're going to have to monitor as time goes on. To go along with that, I know we've talked about the AAM a lot, but the MJO, that's a big thing, especially early in summer. I think I talked about how maybe the pattern isn't set in stone, especially for June. Maybe we go back and forth from warmth in the west and warmth in the Great Lakes. I think that the longer that MJO keeps in its active state, the longer it goes, stays active and it moves all the way across the globe, I think the bigger the risk is that we don't have a set pattern. So that's something we're going to have to watch. If that shuts off around the same time as the AAM, again, I think, as Michael was talking about earlier, that could be when we need to watch for a bigger and more sustained dry and hot pattern. Kirk, why don't you talk about what the activity in the tropics could mean this year?
Yeah, Brett kind of alluded to this earlier too as well. We're so warm. I mean, in terms of our sea surface temperatures from I would say the north of the MDR all the way into the Gulf. We've recently seen some tropical activity in the southeast out there as well, and there's a lot of extensive research articles out there that tie La Niñas, or going more into a La Niña, towards less wind shear. And when you have less wind shear and warmer waters in the tropics, 1 + 1 equals more likely tropical activity as well. So that's one of the reasons why that we have a hard time going warmer, especially if you're concerned with energy demand. Why we have a hard time going warmer in Texas and the southeast areas, because of that tropical risk and just the potential for multiple. I mean, every one of our analog years where we go from El Nino towards a La Nina tendency, or at least normal to above normal in the tropical activity. So that's a risk. Why is it more of a risk to the ag belt as well, especially east and southeast? Well, that can push a lot of moisture up in those areas. That can keep overnight low temperatures elevated. That can maybe increase disease pressure and risk in that direction as well. I think that is a very real risk, when we're talking about tropical activity, a warmer than normal summer. Maybe you could equate it to 2018 in terms of overnight lows, or 2010. I think if there's a risk, maybe not so much towards a drought or drier risks for the eastern belt, maybe it's more too much moisture, too warm overnight, or some disease pressure in terms of the tropics being overall more than active.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Valid points for sure. And to finally touch on that AAM, this is a very important note on the AAM, and that is, if it doesn't drop, if we just don't see it drop, I can't, my gut says it will, but if it doesn't, the tendency would favor more of a ridge over the Great Lakes and wetter risks in the plains. It would maybe break the drought west and shift the dry risk east. I really think summer as a whole hinges on this. I really do, on the AAM.
Yeah.
I really do. I do believe that to be true. So just something to keep in mind. We've got to watch that in our daily outlooks, our daily videos. There's no better way to watch that than to watch the analysis daily. Okay. So moving on, the hurricane season, the Atlantic hurricane, the analogs, and Doug, if you're still on, this is where we talked about '05 is still an analog overall. So it was definitely a hyperactive season. But we don't have a season that was below normal in the analog set. We have every indication, every right to believe this year will probably be a very active hurricane year, for many reasons. As Kirk touched on, just the overall lack of wind shear, weaker vertical wind shear, and where the trade winds are just more favorable for that setup. Okay. We're already seeing the warmer waters in the MDR, in the Atlantic and the Gulf, and it's one of those things where we're already seeing tropical activity in the modeling right now. It's and it's late May, so we believe that it's a hyperactive season. It's much above the average here of 13 to 18 storms. You could take the median and say somewhere between 16, and major hurricanes at 3 to 5. Again, take the median, you're at 4. Average on those is around 2.5 major hurricanes per year. So definitely above average on that. And if we had to draw an area where we're going to be watching, it's certainly looking like this would be the area for now where the most favored activity could be for the above normal hurricane risks. Especially given that we see all this cool water up in here. I don't think the Northeast coast is that much of a risk, versus the Southeast. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that one thing that you may note is that the total storms, we're not going quite as high as some of those other more active years like 95 and an 05. And part of that is because those cooler waters off the East Coast. And you've also got some cooler waters down pretty far south in the southern parts of the MDR. And I think that could kind of we could kind of get into a setup where we see a lot of storms developing further west in the Caribbean. So maybe you don't have as many storms as some of these very active years, but you can have more intense storms, if that makes sense. Yeah, right in there where Michael circled. So I think that we may get into a setup like that, and we've seen that the last couple of years, though, because the Atlantic ocean temperature pattern hasn't changed a whole lot the last couple of years. It's very similar, and you've seen what's happened in the last couple of years in Maria and Harvey and Michael. There's been several of them.
So to talk about this, anytime we place a ridge over the water, if this is a factor we were going to consider, if the AAM were to stay positive, you'd have a ridge somewhere in here, and you'd probably steer, as Brett mentioned, you may be steering these things right up into this area, and so maybe if there's an area where we could say there's an elevated risk, maybe it is the Gulf Coast, pending how that AAM behavior goes. But that's just kind of 101 stuff. If the ridge is there and we think this is the area that could be favored, maybe this is the area we need to watch. Mm-hmm. It's just an idea, guys. It's just the general direction of the upper level winds is going to steer these storms.
Yeah.
So we just have to see where they go.
Yeah. Next 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So let's head on over to the end show here. We've got some questions. Before I get to the questions, we do have, again, our brand new app available for all iOS products, Droid in 2 weeks. This thing's awesome. I mean, we've taken pricing, everything into consideration. We've made it incredibly affordable, and we've put just the latest and greatest technology right in the palm of your hand. I mean, push notifications of cloud-to-ground lightning strikes, location-specific weather alerting, the ability to chat with a meteorologist at any time in the app, one-on-one, point-and-click QPE. That's been a huge hit. The QPE data in the app, you can zoom down to field level. You can get QPE estimates. Some services charge $1,000 a year just for QPE data. Okay, but we've put a lot of effort into the methodology, the data into the app. All right, this is a huge deal. You get everything: our long range, our state, our support, our radar, our hour by hour, everything into the app. You can get an all-in price at $810 a year, which is half the cost of what these subscriptions we used to run. We've literally redone it all, guys. We've revamped, and the app is in the last 2 days we have absolutely exploded with the app. It has been unbelievable, the people that are interested. So I'm going to answer questions. Okay. Doug says, thank you for the explanation and response. You're welcome, Doug. Thank you. Dale says, is the steep decline in airline flights and the weather data they provide causing more uncertainty, instability in the weather models? What do you guys think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't see how it doesn't. I mean, you have half as many flights, and those flights do have, every one of them have weather sensors. You don't have those weather sensors, your forecast error can grow significantly. I mean, I can't tell you the last time I've seen so much variability from the pattern in the 10 to 15 to what it looks like in the 1 to 5. I mean, it just makes a hard job harder.
Yeah, we've seen it in the scores too. We've seen more big drops in the verifications than I think that we've seen in the last couple of the prior months to this. It's definitely the skills scores, and Dr. Maui, he can post something on, he's posted stuff on Twitter about it, but the verifications the last 30 days are lower than what they had been the 90 days before that. So it's not like they're completely unusable, but definitely not as good for sure.
We have a couple of people that want to do some verbal questions. Brian's going to patch them in.
Yeah, so first up is Patrick.
Oh.
Patrick, go ahead.
Your mic is muted, Patrick. There you go.
Patrick? I don't think Patrick's mic's working. So we're going to go ahead and move on to Tom. Tom Stribling. Go ahead. What's your question?
Tom's muted.
Yeah, his mic's muted.
And all right. Well, never mind. We'll move on and try that later.
If you guys had questions, it would be best to type them. Send them over in the Q&A. That way we don't have to worry about patching you in. Let me get to the other one. Mika Mitchell says, this is off topic. Maybe you want to think about it and answer outside of the presentation. With the QBO out of phase, AAM not dropping with Nina, etc., it seems the last couple of years the pattern drivers that usually go in hand are now disconnected. We've been in a warm climate cycle for 35 years. Could the disconnected drivers be an indication we're about to flip back to 30-year cool climate cycle? Sure, possibly, Mika. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you could say that with confidence. There's been talk from several industry professionals that the low solar and all this other stuff should have led to a string of colder and more intense winters, and we just haven't seen it yet. Maybe the big change that was needed is a developing La Nina event to change up the Pacific pattern in general. So maybe that is possible, but that's a loaded question, very great question. And it speaks to the understanding that you have of the atmosphere, but that's a tough one. We'll talk more about that later. Josh says, after back-to-back record years for precipitation in the Dakotas, what are you guys seeing for this year? Brett? Sure.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I think we've already seen differences because spring hasn't been nearly as wet up there as it has been the last couple of years. I still think that, especially in Minnesota, especially to your east, I think that you've got those MCS risks, and I do think that at times you're going to get those to develop in the Dakotas. The tough part about up there is that it could be hit and miss. It's all about where the ridge is exactly oriented, because you all are kind of on the line about, does it initiate in the Dakotas or does it initiate in Minnesota? Yeah. And so I think that you could have a lot of, and I know we've said this before, I think that we could have a lot of have and have nots in the Dakotas, where some places get hit multiple times and are very, very wet, and then other places are really dry. And I know that's not probably the answer you were looking for, but that's just the truth, unless you all have something else you'd like to add.
No, I think overall up there, it's just this winter we have. I mean, think about the years past. We've been blasted by blizzards and big winter storms. We don't have that subsoil moisture, and a lot of times you can see when you have that going out of winter and into spring, you can just see that continuing into summer like we did last year, and we're just seeing the direct opposite of that. So I don't see a lot of major problems up there. I mean, it will be hit or miss, and it will be variable, but I would say versus last year, it's a 180 in terms of soil moisture up there, and seeing a little bit more of a lack of. We don't have as much of a jet stream influence up there as we've had in years past as well. So I'm not seeing an overwhelmingly precipitation-induced pattern.
Okay, so we've got several more questions. Let's make the answers quick. Steve says, at this time you are not looking at a market-moving event for grain. Steve, I believe we may be looking at that if the AAM goes negative. In these years, in these La Ninas, it is possible that happens. And I think that there could be a market-moving event sometime late June and sometime into July. I can't speak to the nature of that I can tell you that I think there can be a problematic weather pattern for a time.
Yeah.
That's the best answer I got. So next question.
2016 had that. It was just a little earlier.
Right. Kyle says, could clouds and precip early in the summer along and over the Gulf of Mexico inhibit late summer development due to cooler water?
It's a good
Yeah, it's
question.
possible. Yeah. The water stays cooler there. It certainly inhibits the development. Josh says, thank you. Thank you for watching, Josh. Chuck Shelby, how you doing, sir? Thanks for watching. He says, how will the temps be out west? Will they have many days near 100 degrees? I think they'll have plenty.
Yeah, I do. Especially west of western half of Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado. Those areas. I think Panhandle of Texas. I mean, we've already seen some record-breaking temperatures in those areas. I think it just continues.
Blake says, will La Niñas and El Niños ever end? No, they will not.
Yeah, or El Niñas, as we call them.
Right. Yeah, those are always going to keep happening. Andy says, in 2012, South Central Indiana had a bad drought. Was that due to the AAM or something else?
The AM was negative that year, if I'm remembering right.
Like the whole time.
Yeah, it was not a La Nina either.
No, it wasn't.
The
That's the
neutral
interesting
Enzo.
thing.
Yeah.
But I think, again, the neutral cooler Enzo, if you will, and the negative AAM just drawn out for 2 months.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and those waters west of Mexico, what we call PMM, were just
that's probably the big thing.
substantially cold, and that just simply means a no jet stream at all.
Yep. No subtropical jet whatsoever.
That was probably bigger than Enzo that year,
Yeah.
if I had to guess, because it
That's
was
number
really,
one.
yeah.
And we don't have any
1988.
indication of that right now. The PMM's warm right now.
Yeah, North Pacific is warm. That's why if you do not drop the AAM, you will be wet. Just simply.
Great question, Andy. Anonymous, will Indianapolis area have a hot summer with very little precip? I don't think so. I think we'll see, we average 17, 90-degree days a summer. I think we could approach 25, maybe 30, 90-degree days. I think we could be above average on the 90-degree day statistic, and I think nighttime lows can be elevated. But I don't think we're going to have an issue with dry yet. Now, the American modeling, the CFS, is drying up the June forecast rather quickly in the Eastern Corn Belt. So that's why we said at the beginning of this, this is a difficult forecast. Okay.
Yep.
If it
Got to watch it every day.
if it went hot and dry, I'm not going to be shocked. It's not going to surprise me if it goes hot and dry.
Yep.
But from a persistence standpoint, it's been very wet. So we're not seeing shutoffs yet and precipitation indicators. Primarily the PMM and the PDO and the AMO. These indicators in the ocean waters are not in drought indication statuses yet.
Yeah.
All right. So next question. Eric says, job well done. Thank you so much, Eric. Appreciate that. John says, what are your thoughts for New York for the summer season to rainfall and temps in comparison to the Midwest? Probably a little bit wetter and a little bit warmer on the periphery of the eastern side of the ridge. You can go back and watch the outlook there for the Northeast, but that's probably the outcome there. So all the questions are answered for now. So if anyone has
Messages.
There's one in the Zoom chat. Let's see, from Ran.
this guy
Yes.
said,
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, but he said, ran from Israel. Thanks for the explanations. That's really cool. Thanks for watching. Did he have a question?
Yeah, there was one in the chat. It says, I know it's a bit of a long shot, but do you see the La Nina pattern shaping up affecting next winter? And I certainly think it's going to change things up into next winter. We haven't seen a La Nina in years.
Yeah.
I
know what an El Nino brings.
yeah.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't expect. Now, we haven't started looking into winter, so maybe there's other stuff that could drive it, but I wouldn't expect it to look like last winter, because last winter was classic, strong El Nino type of pattern.
Mm-hmm.
wondering another issue. How do you assess the GFS FV4 compared to the legacy version? Do you still use the legacy models? The GFS Legacy isn't actually, I don't even look at it anymore. I don't think it's even produced anymore. Is it?
I don't think so, no.
That I know of.
Yeah.
Not that we know of. I mean, we've noticed some glaring issues in the FV4 product with thermal dynamics. And the problem with thermal profiling in the model is bad. Has a very hard time. It did horrible this winter with the snow events.
Yeah.
And just the precipitation type and everything else. It did very, very, very bad. So
Yeah.
I'm not impressed.
Yeah. It's not getting much better.
No.
All right.
So anything else? Okay. He said, thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much. Guys, thank you all for attending and listening. If you're curious about the app, I'm telling you, it's something that it's a tool in the belt, a tool in the shed, if you will, that can really help you guys. So, from all of us here at BAM, thank you so much for attending our growing season webinar. This forecast will continue to evolve. This is a difficult one. This is not a slam dunk. Our confidence is not high. Don't run away and say, BAM said this is what's going to happen. That's not it. This is a daily evolution, and if you're not watching it daily, you'll likely be caught off guard at some point this summer.
Yeah.
All right, guys. So thank you so much for your time and watching, and everybody have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Very, very good. Very interesting. Thank you, Michael, and your team, everybody, for putting this out. Very useful information. And that weather porthole app, as well as the website, really like that, especially that 36-hour outlook. It gives you a very in-depth view into rain events that are coming up and when and where you need to shut down the sprayer and things like that. That's always been very useful. And without further ado, we're going to wrap this podcast up. It's been an extra long one, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give us a 5-star review. It really does help. And listen to us wherever you get your podcast. As always, we tell you every time, there are many parts of this broadcast that are copyrighted and protected, and so we ask that you share it on the podcast platforms that you're used to listening. When you do that, to your friends, as well as we'll wrap up today's agronomy moment. It's presented by Top Ag Media. This has been episode 7. And we thank you for listening. Until next time.